Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, between the French army led by Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and the Russian forces under General Mikhail Kutuzov, was one of the most significant and bloody battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Located near the village of Borodino, about 125 kilometers west of Moscow, this battle marked a decisive moment in Napoleon's campaign to conquer Russia. The day-long clash ended in heavy casualties for both sides, showcasing the determination of the Russian army and the immense costs of Napoleon's ambition to dominate Europe. Background to the invasion of Russia. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was fueled by a mix of political and strategic motivations. The French emperor had established dominance across much of Europe through a series of military victories and alliances, but his relationship with Russia, particularly with Tsar Alexander I, was becoming strained. Tensions arose as Russia's economy suffered under the Continental System, a trade embargo imposed by Napoleon to weaken Britain economically by isolating it from European markets. However, the embargo harmed Russian interests, and Tsar Alexander ultimately abandoned it, effectively challenging Napoleon's authority. Seeing Russia's defiance as a threat to his influence in Europe, Napoleon decided to launch a large-scale invasion to compel the Russian Empire back into compliance. This campaign, known as the Russian Campaign, or the Patriotic War of 1812 in Russia, was among the largest military operations in history, with Napoleon amassing the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men drawn from multiple European nations. The invasion began in June 1812, but instead of facing Napoleon directly, the Russian army implemented a strategy of strategic withdrawal, avoiding major confrontations while drawing the French forces deeper into Russian territory. This approach, coupled with the scorched earth policy, where the Russians destroyed resources that could aid the French, aimed to exhaust and weaken the Grande Armée. By early September, however, the Russian forces, recognizing the need to defend Moscow, prepared to confront Napoleon near Borodino. Tapshar, the battle begins. The battlefield at Borodino was strategically selected by the Russian command. It included high ground, rivers, and defensive earthworks, such as the Nevsky Redoubt, which became focal points of the battle. Both armies were massive. Napoleon commanded around 130,000 men with over 500 artillery pieces, while Kutuzov led around 120,000 troops with a comparable number of cannons. At dawn on September 7th, Napoleon ordered his artillery to bombard the Russian positions, signaling the beginning of the battle. The struggle for the redoubt. The Nevsky Redoubt became the scene of some of the most brutal fighting of the day. French troops launched multiple assaults, often met with stiff resistance from Russian infantry and artillery. Each wave of attack resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, with neither willing to yield ground. The battle for the redoubt symbolized the resilience of the Russian army, as Kutuzov's troops repeatedly counterattacked to reclaim lost ground, causing immense casualties among the French. Despite repeated French attacks, Kutuzov's forces managed to hold their lines, at least temporarily. However, the intensity of the struggle took a toll on both armies, with soldiers facing not only the horrors of combat, but also the weariness of an exhausting day under harsh conditions. The fields were soon littered with casualties, and the once orderly ranks of soldiers became a chaotic, bloody struggle for survival. Napoleon's strategic decisions. A crucial moment in the battle came when Napoleon was presented with an opportunity to deploy his Imperial Guard, an elite reserve force that he often saved for decisive moments. Some of Napoleon's generals, including Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, urged him to use the Guard to break the Russian lines definitively. However, Napoleon hesitated, perhaps fearing the high risk of committing his best soldiers far from France without clear assurance of victory. This decision has been widely debated by historians, as the commitment of the Imperial Guard might have tipped the scales in Napoleon's favor. Nevertheless, Napoleon's caution highlighted his growing apprehension about the campaign, as he recognized the vulnerability of his position so deep within enemy territory. Without the additional push from the Imperial Guard, the French were unable to secure a breakthrough, and the battle devolved into a grinding contest of attrition. By late afternoon, both armies were exhausted, and the fighting gradually slowed. Although the French ultimately captured the Nevsky Redoubt, They failed to destroy the Russian army, which withdrew from the battlefield in an orderly fashion, preserving much of its fighting capability. Aftermath and casualties. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history. Estimates of casualties vary, but the French are believed to have suffered around 30,000 casualties, while Russian losses were even higher, with as many as 45,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The scale of destruction shocked both armies as well as observers in Europe. The sheer brutality of the battle underscored the high stakes of the Napoleonic Wars and the Russian determination to resist foreign invasion at any cost. Despite the enormous losses, Napoleon technically emerged as the victor, as he held the battlefield at the end of the day. However, the outcome was far from a decisive victory. The Russian army, though battered, had not been destroyed, and Kutuzov retained enough strength to continue resisting Napoleon's advance. Moreover, the strategic significance of Borodino was limited. While Napoleon proceeded to occupy Moscow a week later, he found the city abandoned and largely burned, denying him the political leverage he had hoped to gain. The retreat from Moscow. The occupation of Moscow marked a turning point in Napoleon's Russian campaign. Instead of surrendering or negotiating, Tsar Alexander I resolved to continue the fight, refusing to make peace with the French invader. Meanwhile, the hardships facing the Grande Armée multiplied. Lacking supplies and shelter in a hostile and desolate Moscow, the French forces began to suffer from hunger, cold, and deteriorating morale. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow in October, the army faced the onset of the harsh Russian winter, as well as constant harassment from Russian forces. The retreat turned into a catastrophic march of death, with thousands of soldiers succumbing to starvation, exposure, and relentless Russian attacks. By the time Napoleon's forces crossed back into Polish territory, the Grande Armée had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 survived the campaign. The Battle of Borodino thus marked not only a physical, but also a psychological defeat for Napoleon, as the failure to decisively defeat the Russian army foreshadowed the larger collapse of his ambitions. Legacy and significance. The Battle of Borodino has since been remembered as a defining moment in Russian history and a symbol of national resistance. In Russia, it became emblematic of the country's resilience and willingness to endure hardship in defense of its homeland. The Russian Orthodox Church later canonized those who died in the battle, and the field at Borodino became a place of national remembrance. In 1839, the first monuments were erected to honor the Russian soldiers who fought there, and the battle is commemorated annually in Russia on September 8th. For Napoleon, Borodino marked the beginning of the end. Although he would continue to fight and achieve victories in subsequent campaigns, his failure in Russia tarnished his reputation for invincibility and emboldened his enemies across Europe. The losses he incurred weakened his empire, leading to a renewed coalition of European powers determined to bring an end to his rule. In 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate, and he was exiled to the island of Elba, only to return briefly before his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. In military history, the Battle of Borodino is studied as a classic example of the limits of military power and the complexities of strategic decision-making. It demonstrates how even a tactically skilled general like Napoleon could be undone by logistical challenges, harsh environments, and a determined enemy unwilling to capitulate. The battle's legacy endures, symbolizing the high cost of imperial ambition and the resilience of nations faced with invasion.